In the cavernous, frescoed dining hall of Riccardo Falcone's estate, 23 men sat dead at their banquet table. They weren't riddled with bullets or marked by the blade of a knife. They were perfectly still, their hands resting on the fine silverware, their mouths agape as if in mid-sentence, their eyes wide with a final shared surprise. The air, thick with the smell of roasted boar and spilled Chianti, held a silence so profound it was like a physical weight. The only thing missing from the macabre tableau was a single person, the quiet, unassuming serving girl who had poured their last glass of wine. The authorities would call it the single most baffling mass death in the history of American organized crime. The underworld would whisper a different story, a legend of a cursed feast and a ghost who served it. But to understand how a fortress of power became a silent tomb, and how 23 of the city's most brutal men could be extinguished without a single shot fired, we must go back 6 months earlier to a different kind of gathering. A night of obscene theater where the city's darkest souls convened, and where Don Marcello Bellini, a man known as the Chimera, made a purchase that would unravel it all. We must go back to the night of the auction, the night he bought the last woman, and in doing so, sealed the fate of every man in that room. The air in the clandestine warehouse hummed with the electric tension of a predator's den. It smelled of damp concrete, expensive cigar smoke, and the cloying perfume of fear. This was Riccardo the Vulture Falcone's domain, a place where power was not just wielded, but bought, sold, and paraded like livestock. Tonight's parade was of human flesh. Women, stolen from ports and back alleys, were presented under the harsh glare of a single spotlight on a makeshift stage. They were beautiful, broken things, their eyes vacant, their futures already erased. The men in the audience, the capos and dons of the East Coast syndicates, bid with casual cruelty, their voices thick with whiskey and entitlement. Don Marcello Bellini watched from the shadows at the back, his face a mask of bored indifference. He was a man of a different era, a Sicilian traditionalist who found Falcone's business vulgar, a stain on the concept of honor, however stained it already was. But in their world, power demanded presence. To be absent was to be forgotten, and to be forgotten was to be dead. He was here to be seen, a silent lion observing the jackals at play. One by one, the women were sold. A blonde from Ohio, a fiery redhead from the Irish slums, a dark-eyed girl who still carried the scent of the Naples coast. The bidding was brisk, a grotesque pissing contest of wealth and dominance. And then, she was brought out, the last one. She was nothing like the others. Where they were curated for beauty, she seemed assembled from leftover parts. She was gaunt, her dress hanging from her thin frame like a shroud. A jagged, silvery scar ran from her temple down her cheek, pulling one side of her mouth into a permanent, unnerving smirk. But it was her eyes that silenced the room. They weren't empty or broken. They were ancient, still, and held a chilling clarity. They swept over the crowd of powerful men not with fear, but with something that looked unnervingly like assessment. The auctioneer, a sweating, pockmarked man, began his spiel, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. And finally, number 12. A rare find. Resilient. The word hung in the air. A poor choice. A nervous titter went through the crowd. No one raised a hand. They looked at each other, shaking their heads. Whispers slithered through the smoke. "That's the one from the docks," one capo murmured to another. "The one they found on the ghost ship. They say the whole crew was dead when they brought it in. Not a mark on them." Superstition was the unofficial religion of the mob, a current that ran deeper than faith or family. This woman wasn't just damaged goods. She was an omen. She was bad luck incarnate. Falcone, watching from his perch, grew visibly irritated. The unsold lot was an insult, a chink in the armor of his fearsome reputation. $1,000, a voice cut through the silence. Every head turned. It was Marcello Bellini. His consigliere, Silvio, shifted uncomfortably beside him, his eyes wide with disbelief. Falcone's scowl turned into a predatory grin. 1,000 from Don Bellini. Do I hear 1,500? The room was silent. The other bosses looked at Marcello as if he'd lost his mind. They wouldn't bid against him out of respect, but more than that, they wouldn't take the woman, even if he paid them. Marcello held Falcone's gaze, his expression unchanging. 1,000, he repeated, his voice calm, but with the finality of a closing crypt. Falcone, eager to be rid of her and save face, slammed his gavel. Sold! To the Chimera! As she was led off the stage, her eyes met Marcello's for a fleeting second. There was no gratitude, no fear. There was only a silent, unnerving acknowledgement. Marcello had not just bought a woman. He had purchased a mystery, a whispered curse that the most dangerous men in the city were too afraid to touch. And as he walked out into the cold night air, even he could not have known that he had just acquired the key to his own salvation and the architect of his rival's annihilation. The only question was, what secrets were locked behind those ancient, watchful eyes? Marcello Bellini's estate was a world away from the grimy warehouse. It was a sprawling stone mansion perched on a hill overlooking the city, a fortress disguised as a monument to old-world elegance. Manicured gardens, silent statues, and thick oak doors created an atmosphere of oppressive quiet. This was Ilara's new home, her gilded cage. She was given a small, Spartan room in a disused wing of the house, traditionally reserved for distant, disfavored relatives. The staff, the maids, the cooks, the gardeners, were instructed to give her food and leave her be. They treated her like a phantom, scurrying away when she entered a room, their eyes darting towards her scarred face before looking away, their hands making subtle gestures to ward off the evil eye. They had heard the whispers from the city, the story of the Don's strange purchase, the cursed woman from the ghost ship. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a contagion of misfortune that their boss, in his infinite and terrifying wisdom, had inexplicably invited into their home. Marcello's men were even more unnerved. They were soldiers, men of action who understood violence born from lead and steel. They did not understand this silent, wraith-like woman who roamed the halls. They saw their Don, a man of meticulous habits and cold logic, show a strange interest in her, and it sowed confusion among the ranks. It was a sign of eccentricity, and in their world, eccentricity was a weakness to be exploited. Silvio, Marcello's consigliere for over 40 years, was the most vocal in his concern. He was a small, stooped man with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall in the city's underworld. He found Marcello in his study, a room paneled with dark mahogany and lined with books on history and philosophy. Marcello was not looking at his ledgers or listening to reports. He was arranging pieces on a marble chessboard. "Marcello," Silvio began, his voice raspy with age and worry. "The men are talking. They don't understand. Falcone mocked you tonight. He sold you his garbage, and you paid for it." Marcello moved a knight, his eyes not leaving the board. "Falcone thinks he sold me a broken toy. The others think he sold me a curse." He looked up at Silvio. "They are both fools. They see a scar and a rumor. They don't see the engine ticking behind her eyes." For days, Marcello did not command Ilara, nor did he threaten her. He simply observed. He would have a tray of food sent to her room, not just with bread and cheese, but with a strange assortment of items: a dead bird, a withered flower, a small bottle of unidentified liquid. He was testing her, but not for obedience. He was testing for knowledge. Ilara never touched the food. She would simply rearrange the items on the tray into strange, deliberate patterns, a message. One day, he entered her room himself. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, perfectly still, watching the rain streak down the window pane. He placed a small, locked metal box on the table. "Open it," he said. He offered no key. He simply left it there and walked out. He watched her through a strategically placed peephole in the wall, an old trick of the house's paranoid former owner. Ilara did not smash the box or try to pry it open. She simply picked it up, held it to her ear, and tilted it back and forth, listening to the subtle shift of the tumblers inside. She took a hairpin from her disheveled bun, bent it with her teeth, and in less than a minute the lock clicked open. Inside was a single, withered black rose. She looked directly at the peephole, as if she had known he was there all along. In that moment, Marcello knew his gamble was paying off. This was not a victim. This was not a curse. This was a weapon of a kind he had never seen before, a key that could unlock doors no amount of brute force could ever open. The question was no longer what she was, but what she was for. And as he walked away from the door, a plan, cold and intricate, began to form in his mind. A plan to cure the sickness that was rotting his own family from within. To understand the woman named Ilara, you must understand that she was not born, but forged. Her story didn't begin in a warm home, but in a cold, isolated convent in the remote hills of Sicily, a place that had long ago traded prayer for poison. This was the home of the Sorelle Silenziose, the Silent Sisters, a forgotten order that served the oldest and most secretive of the old country families. They were not wives or mothers. They were whispers, the unseen hand that balanced the scales of power when wars were too loud and too costly. They raised orphans, girls taken from tragedy and destitution, and stripped them of their names, their pasts, and their futures. They were remade into living weapons, masters of a silent, invisible art. Ilara's childhood was not one of games and fairy tales, but of lessons in botany, chemistry, and human anatomy. She learned which mushrooms brought peaceful sleep and which brought agonizing death. She learned how to extract the venom from a scorpion and the toxins from the bark of a yew tree. She could identify 36 different varieties of nightshade by scent alone. Her lullabies were lists of alkaloids and their effects on the human heart. Her training was brutal and absolute. The sisters taught her that emotion was a liability, a poison more dangerous than any she could create. She learned to move without being seen, to listen without being heard, and to kill without leaving a trace. She could walk through a crowded room and be as memorable as a shadow. Her face, which others saw as marred and strange, was her greatest asset. It was a face people chose to forget, to look away from. It made her invisible. The scar was the result of her final test, a rite of passage. She and another girl, the only other one to survive the training to that point, were locked in a room for 3 days with a single knife and a cup of water. Only one could walk out. The scar was a reminder of the price of survival, a permanent mark of her graduation into the Order's highest ranks. She served the Order for years, a ghost sent to resolve disputes for powerful men who never even knew her name. But the world was changing. The old ways were dying. A new, more brutal generation of gangsters rose to power. Men like Falcone who dealt in loud, messy violence and had no use for the subtle arts of the sisters. The Order was seen as a relic, and worse, a threat, a secret they couldn't control. A purge was ordered. Her sisters, the only family she had ever known, were slaughtered in a single night by men with machine guns. Ilara, away on a mission, was the sole survivor. She returned to find the convent a smoking ruin. Her world turned to ash. With no one left to serve and nowhere to go, she fled, stowing away on a cargo ship bound for America, hoping to disappear into the teeming, anonymous masses of the New World. But her reputation, the whispers of the cursed woman, followed her across the ocean. The ship she arrived on was indeed a ghost ship. The crew, a brutish lot who had tried to corner her in the cargo hold, had been found dead days later, their bodies contorted in agony from a paralytic neurotoxin she had synthesized from the ship's rat poison. Falcone's men, hearing the legend, found her on the docks, not as a powerful assassin, but as a starving, desperate refugee. They captured her, believing they had tamed a demon. They were wrong. Falcone tried to break her, to turn her into one of his mindless puppets, but he couldn't. He used violence, starvation, and fear. But none of it worked. He was trying to break something that was already broken and rebuilt from steel. He could not understand that she wasn't afraid of death. She lived with it every day. It was her oldest and most intimate companion. So, unable to control her and unwilling to simply kill such a unique asset, he decided to sell her, to turn his failure into a profit. He peddled the story of her curse, hoping to scare a superstitious fool into paying for a legend. He never imagined that a man like Marcello Bellini would see past the ghost story and recognize the chilling truth. That he wasn't selling a curse, he was selling a queen from a forgotten chessboard. The air in Marcello's study was heavy with the silence of unspoken truths. For days he had observed Ilara, and she had observed him. A silent negotiation had taken place, a testing of boundaries, and an assessment of intent. Now, the time for games was over. He sat behind his large oak desk, the chessboard between them. The pieces were arranged in the middle of a game, a complex position where the Black King was slowly being cornered. Elara stood on the other side of the desk, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture still, her expression unreadable. She looked at the board, not at him, that king. Marcello said, his voice a low rumble. He is surrounded by his own men, his knights, his bishops. They protect him, but they also trap him. One of them is a traitor, a viper I allowed to grow fat in my own garden. He finally spoke the name, a word he hadn't uttered aloud in this context before. Vincent Rizzo. He didn't need to explain who Vincent was. As his underboss, the Viper was the second most powerful man in the family and the most ambitious. He was young, popular with the street crews, and saw Marcello's old world traditions as a weakness. He was making moves, forging secret alliances with a rival family from Chicago, preparing to stage a coup. Marcello had seen the signs, the subtle shifts in loyalty, the whispers that stopped when he entered a room. To kill him openly, Marcello continued, gesturing to the board, would be to knock over the whole table. It would trigger a war with Chicago and fracture my own family. His key men, his 4 most loyal capos, would rally behind his memory. It would be bloody, messy, bad for business. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. But if a man like Vincent and his most loyal soldiers were to simply fade away, if they were to be taken by sudden sickness, by the hand of God, by a stroke of cruel fate, then there is no war. There is only a tragedy, and a vacuum that I am perfectly positioned to fill. This was the crux of his plan, the reason he had purchased the city's most feared omen. He didn't need a soldier with a gun. He had hundreds of those. He needed a ghost. He needed an artist whose medium was death itself. Elara remained silent, her gaze still fixed on the chessboard. She reached out a slender finger and gently nudged a black pawn forward 1 square. It was a seemingly insignificant move, but it completely changed the dynamic of the board, creating a new line of attack that the white player hadn't seen. It was her answer. "I will give you what you desire most," Marcello said, understanding her silent acceptance. "More than money, more than power. I will give you absence. A new name, a new life in a country that doesn't know you, with enough money to ensure you are never found. I will erase the ghost of Elara, and in her place, a woman who never existed will be born. You will be free." He was offering to do for her what she could not do for herself, to escape her own legend. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in the depths of her eyes. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was the cold, calculating glint of an opportunity recognized. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was done. The unholy alliance was forged in the silence of that study, over a game of kings and pawns. The Chimera had unleashed his ghost. The methodical, silent cleansing of the Bellini crime family was about to begin, and the first name on Elara's list was already chosen. Vincent Rizzo's foundation was about to crumble, 1 stone at a time. The plan began not with a bang, but with a whisper, carried on the sweet, decadent scent of powdered sugar and ricotta. The first target was Leo, the Gullet Carbone, Vincent Rizzo's most boisterous and gluttonous capo. Leo was a man of simple pleasures and immense appetites. His loyalty to Vincent was cemented by a steady stream of cash and, more importantly, a steady stream of the finest food and drink the city could offer. His weakness was his stomach, and Elara intended to make it his tomb. From her secluded wing in Marcello's mansion, she operated like a spy master. She never left the grounds. Instead, she used the house's network of invisible people, the servants. She spoke to Maria, a young maid whose brother was in prison on a trumped-up charge, a charge Marcello could make disappear. Elara didn't threaten or command. She spoke to Maria in quiet, reassuring tones, learning about her family, her fears, her hopes. She forged a bond of trust, a currency more valuable than fear. Through Maria, Elara learned Leo Carbone's routines. Every Tuesday, without fail, he received a large box of cannoli from his favorite bakery, a gift from Vincent to reward his loyalty. This was the delivery system. In the mansion's vast, dark kitchen, long after the cooks had gone to bed, Elara went to work. This was her laboratory, her sanctuary. She moved with a silent, practiced efficiency, The poison she chose was a masterpiece of subtlety, derived from the seeds of the foxglove flower, which grew harmlessly in Marcello's own gardens. Digitalis, a powerful cardiac glycoside. In the right dose, it was a medicine used to treat heart failure. In a slightly higher dose, it was a lethal, untraceable poison that perfectly mimicked the symptoms of a massive coronary thrombosis. A man like Leo Carbone, with his weight, his drinking, his diet, no coroner would ever question a heart attack. The artistry was in the application. She couldn't poison the entire batch. She carefully injected a concentrated dose into the ricotta filling of just 2 cannoli, knowing from Maria that Leo always ate the first and the last one himself, leaving the rest for his underlings. She then resealed the box with a forger's precision, leaving no trace of tampering. The next day was a symphony of tension. Maria, her hands trembling, swapped the bakery boxes during the delivery, her heart pounding in her chest. The hours ticked by like water torture. Marcello sat in his study, waiting. Ilara sat in her room, perfectly still, betraying no emotion. The call came just after 9 o'clock that night. Silvio delivered the news, his face pale. Leo Carbone was dead. He had been laughing with his men, had just finished his second cannoli when he clutched his chest, a look of surprise on his face, and fell to the floor. He was dead before he hit the Persian rug. The doctor on Vincent's payroll had declared it a massive heart attack, a tragedy waiting to happen. Vincent Rizzo was saddened, but not suspicious. Not yet. He saw it as a sad consequence of his friend's lifestyle. But in the quiet halls of Marcello Bellini's mansion, the first stone had been removed from Vincent's foundation. It had been done so silently, so flawlessly, that no one even heard it fall. It was the perfect crime, a death hidden in plain sight. And as Marcello looked out at the city lights, he felt a cold chill of awe. He had known Ilara was a weapon, but he was only now beginning to understand the terrifying, beautiful precision of her craft. The whispers had just begun. The death of Leo Carbone was a ripple. The death of the second man was a wave that crashed against the shore of Vincent Rizzo's confidence. This target was a far greater challenge, a man who was Leo's polar opposite. His name was Frankie the Saint Jenna, a capo known for his quiet piety and deep-seated paranoia. Frankie trusted no one. He didn't drink, he didn't philander, and he only ate food prepared by the hands of his wife of 30 years. A poisoned meal was impossible. An arranged accident would be too obvious. Frankie's life was a fortress of routine and suspicion, and Ilara had to find a key to a lock no one else could see. Again, she turned to her network of whispers. She learned everything about Frankie. He was a devout Catholic, attending Mass every single morning at St. Michael's in the old neighborhood. He took communion, knelt at the same spot in the same pew, and would often stay behind to quietly pray, his hands clutching a set of antique rosary beads. This was his only unguarded ritual, his one moment of true faith. This would be the point of entry. Ilara's method this time was more exotic, a testament to the depth of her arcane knowledge. She chose dimethylmercury, a colorless, faintly sweet-smelling liquid. It was a slow-acting and devastating neurotoxin, a substance so potent that a few drops absorbed through the skin would be a death sentence. The symptoms wouldn't appear for weeks, even months, beginning with a tingling in the fingers and toes, followed by a slow, agonizing descent into blindness, madness, and death. It was a truly horrific way to die, and it would leave doctors utterly baffled. The execution required the delicate touch of a ghost. Marcello, using his considerable influence, arranged for the church's precious metals to be brought to a specialist for polishing and cleaning as a gift to the parish. That specialist was Ilara, working by candlelight in a secure room in the mansion's deep cellars. She wore thick protective gloves as she carefully applied a thin, invisible film of the substance to the silver filigree of Frankie's favorite rosary beads and, for good measure, to the rim of the communion chalice. The items were returned to the church, their luster restored, their surfaces now bearing a fatal secret. For 2 weeks nothing happened. Vincent Rizzo, while mourning Leo, had begun to consolidate his power, promoting one of his own men to fill the dead capo's shoes. He was growing more confident. Then, the news began to trickle out. Frankie Jenna was unwell. He was complaining of numbness in his hands. He was dropping things. A week later, he was having trouble seeing, stumbling into furniture in his own home. His wife was frantic. Doctors were called, specialists brought in. They ran every test, but found nothing. They whispered about rare neurological diseases, perhaps a brain tumor. Frankie, meanwhile, was losing his mind, consumed by a sickness with no name and no cause. His paranoia, once a tool for survival, became a raging inferno. He accused his wife of poisoning him. He accused Vincent. He accused Marcello. He became a raving, terrified mess, his body and mind wasting away. His death, when it came a month later, was a relief. The official cause was a mystery, a tragic medical anomaly. But in the underworld, two such strange deaths among Vincent Rizzo's top men was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern. The whispers about Marcello's new woman, the cursed one, began to gain traction. They said she had brought a plague into the city, that she could kill a man with a look. Vincent Rizzo, a man who feared nothing, was now terrified. He was being hunted by a phantom. He couldn't see the enemy, but he could see the bodies of his friends falling around him, and he knew, with a cold certainty that gripped his heart, that the phantom would soon be coming for him. The seeds of paranoia had been sown, and they were taking root in poisoned soil. Vincent Rizzo was a creature of the gutter, a man who had clawed his way up from the streets with his fists and his wits. He was not a superstitious fool. He didn't believe in curses or witches. He believed in power, and he knew that the bizarre, untraceable deaths of two of his most trusted capos were not the work of a phantom. They were the work of an artist, an assassin whose methods were as foreign to him as a forgotten language. And he knew, with every fiber of his being, that the artist belonged to Marcello Bellini. The old Don had brought this woman into his house, and now Vincent's men were dropping like flies. The connection was undeniable, but it was also unprovable. He had no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but a creeping dread that was starting to eat away at his composure. His paranoia became a suffocating blanket. He stopped eating at restaurants. He had his own men watch his wife as she cooked. He trusted no one. But fear, for a man like Vincent, was not a paralytic. It was a catalyst. He knew he couldn't wait to be the next victim of some invisible, creeping death. He had to act. He had to force Marcello out of the shadows and into the open. He needed a war. Vincent devised a plan that was as brutal as it was cunning. He would strike at Marcello, but he would use another man's sword. His target was a fleet of Marcello's shipping trucks, the legitimate front for his liquor distribution empire. Vincent's men, disguised with ski masks and driving unmarked cars, ambushed the convoy on a lonely stretch of highway just after dawn. They didn't just rob the trucks, they annihilated them. They riddled the cabs with machine gun fire, killing two of Marcello's most loyal drivers, and then set the trucks ablaze, creating a funeral pyre of burning rubber and expensive scotch that could be seen for miles. And then came the masterstroke. On the cooling corpse of one of the drivers, they left a calling card, a single, black vulture feather, the unmistakable symbol of Riccardo Falcone. The attack sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. It was a brazen direct assault on the Chimera himself. An act of war. Marcello's capos were baying for blood, demanding immediate and devastating retaliation against Falcone and his entire organization. They saw it as a test of their Don's strength. If he did not respond with overwhelming force, he would be perceived as weak, a relic whose time had passed. This was the trap Vincent had so brilliantly set. Marcello was now in an impossible position. He knew Falcone was not behind the attack. Falcone was a ghoul, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't provoke a full-scale war with the Bellini family over a few trucks of liquor. It had to be Vincent. But Marcello couldn't accuse his own underboss without revealing his hand, without admitting that his own house was in chaos. And he couldn't refuse to retaliate against Falcone, the perceived aggressor, without losing the respect of his own men, the very men whose loyalty he would need to survive Vincent's inevitable coup. He was caught between a war he didn't want and a rebellion he couldn't afford. Vincent had played his card perfectly. He had used Marcello's own strength, his reputation, against him. The old Don was cornered. forced to engage in a loud, bloody, conventional gang war, which would distract him, drain his resources, and make him vulnerable. While Marcello was busy fighting Falcone, Vincent would be free to make his final move. The Viper had sunk his fangs in deep, and the poison was spreading through the Bellini family. Marcello looked at the pieces on his chessboard, and for the first time he couldn't see a winning move. The weight of the impending war settled heavily on the Bellini estate. The air, once filled with a tense but controlled quiet, now crackled with the nervous energy of men preparing for battle. Cars came and went at all hours, carrying soldiers with grim faces and heavy coats. The scent of gun oil replaced the scent of roses in the garden. In the middle of this maelstrom, only two people remained calm. Marcello, who concealed his turmoil behind a mask of stoic resolve, and Ilara, who seemed to exist outside the storm, an island of unnerving stillness. It was Silvio, the old consigliere, who finally broke. He found Marcello late one night in the library staring into a dying fire. Silvio had been with Marcello since they were young men in Sicily, two hungry boys with nothing but ambition. He had seen Marcello transform from a street tough into the feared and respected chimera. He was more than an advisor. He was the keeper of Marcello's conscience, the one man who could speak truth to power without fear of retribution. "You cannot do this, Marcello," Silvio said, his voice a fragile whisper. "You know Falcone is not behind this. This is the Viper's work. You are walking into his trap." Marcello turned from the fire, his face etched with exhaustion. "What would you have me do, old friend? Show my men that their Don is a coward who allows his soldiers to be slaughtered without answer? If I do not act, Vincent will use their anger to turn them against me. He will have me dead within a week." Silvio took a step closer, his dark eyes pleading. "There are other ways, but this path you are on now is darker than any I have seen you walk. It is because of her." He didn't need to say her name. "You brought a specter into this house, Marcello. You think you control it, but you do not. Ghosts don't serve kings. They only haunt ruins." The old man's voice trembled with a deep ancestral fear. "Let me tell you a story from our village. There was a man, a farmer, whose crops were failing. He made a deal with Estrega, a witch of the old ways, to bless his fields. The witch did as he asked, and his harvest was more bountiful than he could have ever imagined. He grew rich and powerful, but the next season, a blight fell upon the village. The other farms withered and died. The animals grew sick. The children were born with defects. The farmer's land was the only one that thrived, an island of green in a sea of decay. He had not paid the witch with coin, but with the luck and life of his neighbors. He destroyed everything around him to save himself. That is what you are doing. This woman, she does not create. She only destroys. She is a blight." Marcello was silent for a long time, the old man's words hanging in the air like smoke. He knew Silvio was right to be afraid. He had felt it himself, that chilling, inhuman quality in Ilara. She was not just a killer. She was an absence of life, a force of pure, cold entropy. He had sought a surgical tool, but he had instead unleashed a plague. "Vincent and his men are a cancer in this family, Silvio," Marcello said finally, his voice hard as granite. "Sometimes the only way to cure a cancer is to burn it out, even if you burn some of the healthy flesh with it. This is a fire I must walk through." Silvio shook his head slowly, his face a mask of sorrow. "Be careful, my friend," he whispered. "When you make a deal with a ghost, you risk becoming one yourself." He turned and left the room, leaving Marcello alone with the crackling embers and the terrifying realization that his oldest friend, the man who had stood by him for 50 years, now looked at him with the same fear that his enemies did. The war outside was coming, but the more dangerous battle was the one for Marcello's own soul. The war was a feint, a brutal piece of theater. Marcello engaged Falcone's forces in a series of sharp, public skirmishes. A bombed-out social club here, a hijacked shipment there. It was costly and violent, just enough to satisfy the bloodlust of his men and maintain the illusion that he was focused on his rival. All the while, his true focus, and Ilara's, remained on Vincent. The Viper, believing his plan had worked perfectly, grew bold. With Marcello distracted, he made his final move. He sent a messenger under a flag of truce to Marcello's estate. The message was an invitation. a peace dinner to be held at Vincent's flagship restaurant, the Grotto, in 2 nights' time. Vincent's proposal was audacious, an alliance. He suggested they join forces to crush Falcone once and for all, and then split his territory. It was, of course, a lie, a trap. Marcello's capos were incensed, seeing the invitation as an insult. But Silvio, the wise old consigliere, saw the truth. "It's an execution," he told Marcello in private. "The restaurant is his fortress. His men will be hidden everywhere. You will walk in, but you will not walk out." Marcello knew this, but what his men didn't know was that he had a spy in the enemy's camp. Not a soldier, but someone far more valuable. Ilara, through her quiet conversations with the maids and servants of the city, had cultivated her own intelligence network. The sister of one of Marcello's cooks worked as a dishwasher at the Grotto. She had overheard Vincent's men talking, laughing about the last supper they were planning for the old Don. She heard them talk about the new soundproofing being installed in the wine cellar, and the extra men who would be working as busboys that night. Men whose hands were more familiar with the cold steel of a pistol than a dinner plate. The trap was real. The night before the dinner, Marcello met with Ilara in the library. The air was thick with the finality of their gambit. Failure meant not just death, but the end of the Bellini legacy. "They will expect me to bring my best soldiers," Marcello said. "They will be prepared for a gunfight." Ilara looked at him, her eyes calm and clear. "Then do not give them one," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She explained her plan. It was not a counter-ambush. It was something far more insidious, something that belonged in the court of the Borgias, not the streets of an American city. It was terrifying in its complexity and elegance. It relied on precise timing, on Vincent's own arrogance, and on a specific old country tradition that Vincent would be forced to observe. At the end of their meeting, she handed him a small unmarked vial containing a clear viscous liquid. "An hour before you leave for the dinner," she instructed. "Drink all of it. It will protect you. Do not eat or drink anything at the restaurant until the toast. And when you give the toast, you must follow my instructions to the letter." Marcello looked at the vial. It was an antidote, a leap of faith. He was placing his life entirely in the hands of this strange, silent woman. It was the ultimate all-is-lost moment. He had to walk willingly into his own execution, armed with nothing but a vial of liquid and a ghost's promise. As he prepared to leave for the dinner the next night, dressed in his finest suit, he looked at his reflection. He saw an old man playing a young man's game, gambling everything on a woman he barely understood. This was not just a battle for his family. It was a battle against the very nature of their world. He was betting that the silent, invisible arts of a forgotten order could triumph over the brute force of the new age. The Grotto was a cavern of false smiles and veiled threats. The air, thick with the aroma of garlic and oregano, buzzed with a deadly energy. Vincent Rizzo stood at the door to greet Marcello, his face a perfect mask of respect and hospitality, but his eyes held the triumphant glint of a predator cornering its prey. He clasped Marcello's hand, a gesture of friendship that felt like a man measuring a body for a coffin. Marcello's most trusted capos, the ones not secretly loyal to Vincent, flanked him, their faces grim, their hands never straying far from the guns hidden beneath their jackets. They walked through the crowded dining room, a sea of hostile faces pretending to be allies, and were led to a large private table at the back. The tension was a physical presence. A third guest at the table, Vincent played the gracious host, ordering bottles of his finest wine, platters of antipasto. Marcello, remembering Ilara's warning, politely declined everything, citing a nervous stomach. His men followed his lead. The small talk was excruciating, a dance of pleasantries over a pit of vipers. Every clink of a glass, every scrape of a chair, sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Vincent watched Marcello, his smile tightening. The old man's abstinence was a sign of fear, he thought. Good. The Viper was enjoying this, drawing out the final moments before the kill. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Vincent raised his glass. "To the future," he said, his voice booming with false sincerity. "A new partnership. To the Bellini family and the Rizzo family working as one." This was the moment. the prearranged signal for his hidden gunmen to prepare. Marcello knew what he had to do. He picked up his own glass and rose slowly to his feet, commanding the room's attention. "To the future," he agreed, his voice steady. "But first, we must honor the past. Vincent, you know the old ways. An agreement of this magnitude, a blood alliance, must be sealed properly, not with your house wine, but with the vino della staffa, the stirrup cup. One bottle, one glass, passed among leaders, a tradition of unbreakable trust." He had invoked a deep, almost sacred Sicilian tradition, one that Vincent, for all his modern brutality, could not refuse without gravely insulting Marcello and revealing his treachery. A flicker of annoyance crossed Vincent's face, but he was trapped by the very culture he sought to overthrow. He barked an order, and a waiter brought a single, dusty bottle of Barolo and one ornate, antique silver goblet. Vincent poured the wine himself and handed the goblet to Marcello. This was the heart of Ilara's plan. The poison was not in the wine. It was not in the glass. It was already in the room. Hours earlier, a cleaner, another of Ilara's invisible contacts, had placed a small, simple block of dry ice laced with a volatile, synthesized cyanide compound into the restaurant's main air ventilation duct. The colorless, odorless gas had been slowly, imperceptibly filling the private dining area for the last hour. It was a binary weapon. The gas itself was inert, harmless, but it was designed to react explosively with a single specific catalyst, a rare sulfite compound used as a preservative in only the most expensive aged Barolos, like the one Vincent had just proudly produced. Marcello raised the goblet. He looked Vincent directly in the eye. "Salute." Then, he performed the final, crucial step. As he brought the glass to his lips, he made a small, seemingly natural gesture, wiping the rim of the goblet with his thumb. The move was not for show. On his thumb, from a special ring Ilara had given him, was a tiny, waxy bead of the antidote, a concentrated dose that would bolster the protection of the liquid he had ingested earlier. He took a sip, the wine, now acting as the final trigger for the poison in the air, mixing with the antidote in his system. And then, as tradition dictated, he passed the goblet to Vincent. Vincent Rizzo took the silver goblet from Marcello's hand, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. This was the final act of his play. The old man had just drunk from the cup of his own demise. He believed Marcello was a fool, clinging to ancient traditions while the world moved on. He raised the cup to his own lips, ready to savor the taste of victory before giving the signal that would turn the room into a slaughterhouse. He never got the chance. As he took a sip of the rich, dark wine, a look of confusion crossed his face. He blinked. The man standing next to him, his most trusted enforcer, suddenly gasped, his hands flying to his throat as if trying to pull in air that was no longer there. His eyes bulged, and he collapsed to the floor without a sound. Then another man dropped, and another. A silent, terrifying wave of death swept through the room. Vincent's hidden gunmen, the men disguised as busboys and waiters, stumbled out from the shadows, their weapons half drawn, before they too crumpled to the ground, their limbs twitching as their bodies were starved of oxygen. There were no gunshots, no screams, only the soft thud of bodies hitting the floor. The air itself had become poison. Vincent stared in horror, the goblet falling from his limp fingers and clattering on the marble floor. He looked at his men, his army, lying dead or dying around him. Then he looked at Marcello. The old Don stood perfectly still amidst the carnage, his face calm, his breathing even. He was completely unaffected. In that instant, Vincent understood. The tradition, the wine, the toast, it was all a trap. He had been played, not by a gangster, but by a sorcerer. He had brought guns to a battle of chemistry. He tried to speak, to curse Marcello's name, but his lungs wouldn't obey. A fire was burning in his chest. His vision blurred, the edges turning dark. The last thing Vincent the Viper Rizzo ever saw was the impassive face of Don Marcello Bellini, looking down at him not with hatred or triumph, but with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing a failed experiment. Marcello watched until the last tremor of life left Vincent's body. He then turned and walked calmly out of the restaurant, leaving behind a silent tableau of death, a modern-day Borgia feast. His own men, who had been waiting outside, looked at him in stunned disbelief as he emerged, alone and unharmed, from the heart of the viper's nest. He said nothing. He simply got into his car and was driven away. When he arrived back at his estate, Ilara was waiting for him in the shadows of the grand foyer. She was holding a small suitcase. Their eyes met across the cavernous room. No words were needed. The debt was paid. Her work was done. Vincent Rizzo and his loyalists had been erased, not with a hail of bullets, but with a whisper of poison. The coup was over before it ever began, and Marcello Bellini's reign was, for the moment, secure. But the ghost who had saved him was now owed her freedom. In the aftermath of the massacre at the grotto, a new legend was born in the city's underworld. The official story, meticulously crafted by Marcello and fed to the press through his contacts, was that a bitter internal power struggle within Vincent's faction had boiled over into a mutual slaughter, likely over a bad batch of poisoned liquor. It was a plausible, if gruesome, narrative in their world. The police, their palms sufficiently greased, were happy to close the case. With Vincent and his loyalists gone, Marcello moved with ruthless efficiency to consolidate his power. He promoted men whose loyalty was absolute, absorbed Vincent's rackets, and re-established his authority with a quiet, terrifying finality. The Chimera was once again the undisputed king of the city. But his most important task was not one of power, but of erasure. He had made a promise to Ilara, and Marcello Bellini, for good or for ill, always honored his agreements. He had to make a ghost disappear. This was a different kind of challenge, one that required the precision of a watchmaker and the resources of a king. In the 1940s, a person could not simply be deleted with a keystroke. An identity had to be unmade and a new one painstakingly built from scratch. Marcello summoned the best forger on the East Coast, an old German artisan who could create a birth certificate, a baptismal record, and a passport that would fool God himself. A new name was chosen, Elena Bianchi. A new history was invented. A quiet war widow from a small village in northern Italy who had just immigrated to South America to live with a distant, fictitious relative. A doctor on Marcello's payroll created a medical history for Elena, detailing a life of robust health. A banker, under duress, created a new account for her with a substantial deposit, enough to last a lifetime. Every detail was considered. Ilara was brought to a discreet dress shop and outfitted with a new wardrobe, the simple, conservative clothes of a grieving widow. Her hair was cut and styled differently. The goal was not to disguise her, but to transform her, to bury the gaunt, haunted woman named Ilara beneath the unassuming persona of Elena. The final step was the journey itself. Marcello arranged for her to travel not on a public passenger ship, but as a special guest on one of his own cargo freighters heading to Buenos Aires. She would have a private cabin and would be treated with the utmost respect by the crew, who were told only that she was a distant cousin of the Don, a woman who needed a new start. The night of her departure, Marcello met her one last time on a foggy, deserted pier. The air was cold and smelled of salt and diesel. He handed her a leather satchel containing her new documents and the key to a safe deposit box in Argentina, which held the bulk of her payment. He had fulfilled his end of the bargain. "Is it enough?" he asked, his voice low. He wasn't just asking about the money. He was asking if this new life, this fabricated existence, could ever be enough to wash away the blood of her past. Ilara, soon to be Elena, looked out at the dark, churning water of the harbor. For a moment, he thought she might not answer. "A weed does not ask if the soil is good," she said, her voice as soft and chilling as the fog. "It only asks for a place to grow." She turned and walked up the gangplank without a backward glance, a shadow disappearing into the belly of the ship. As Marcello watched the freighter pull away from the pier, its horn bellowing a lonely cry into the night, he felt a profound sense of relief, but also a lingering, unshakable dread. He had won. He had secured his empire, but he had done so by unleashing a power he would never truly comprehend. He had erased a ghost, but he knew he would be haunted by her memory for the rest of his days. For a few months, a fragile peace settled over the city. Marcello's empire was secure. His enemies were in the ground, and the ghost who had won his war was gone. He believed the story was over, but he had forgotten about the vulture. Riccardo Falcone had watched the decimation of the Bellini family's internal structure and the subsequent silent massacre at the grotto with a hungry, calculating eye. He was not a man of great intellect, but he possessed a scavenger's cunning. He knew the official story about Vincent's demise was a lie. 20 men, some of the toughest in the city, didn't just drop dead from bad Chianti. It was unnatural, and the only unnatural thing that had entered their world recently was the strange, scarred woman he had mockingly sold to Marcello at the auction. Falcone started asking questions, putting his ear to the ground. He paid informants, squeezed low-level associates, and slowly, piece by piece, he began to connect the whispers. The cursed woman from the ghost ship, the sudden, inexplicable deaths of Marcello's rivals, the silent feast at the grotto. It all pointed back to her. Falcone didn't understand how she did it, but he knew she was Marcello's secret weapon, and now she was gone. He saw weakness. He believed Marcello had lost his most valuable asset and was now vulnerable. Falcone began to circle, testing Marcello's defenses. A few of Marcello's businesses were vandalized. A numbers runner was beaten. They were small provocations, but they were a clear message. I know your secret, and I am coming for you. Marcello was in a bind. Falcone's organization was sprawling and messy. He couldn't use Ilara's methods against him. There were too many heads on that particular hydra. A conventional war would be protracted and devastating, undoing all the stability he had just fought to secure. He needed leverage. He needed a way to decapitate Falcone without firing a shot. He was contemplating this problem late one night in his study when a letter arrived. It had no postmark, delivered by an unknown hand. The paper was plain, the handwriting elegant and precise. It was from her. The letter was short. It did not speak of her new life or offer any pleasantries. It simply stated a fact. Riccardo Falcone's greatest weakness is not his greed, but his vanity. He keeps a second set of ledgers, not for money, but for sins. A detailed record of every judge, politician, and police captain he owns. He calls it his Book of Saints. He reads it every night before he sleeps to remind himself that he is a king. It is not in his safe. It is in a hollowed-out Bible in the chapel on his estate. It was the key. The one piece of information that could bring Falcone's entire empire crashing down, not with bullets, but with ink. But getting it was impossible. Falcone's estate was a fortress, his private chapel the most heavily guarded room in it. It was a suicide mission, but the letter contained one final sentence, a chilling proposition. On the eve of St. Sebastian's Day, he hosts a grand banquet for his inner circle, a celebration of his power. A performance is required. Allow me to be the final act. It was an offer. One last service. Ilara, from her new life halfway across the world, had seen the threat to Marcello, and by extension, the threat to her own hard-won anonymity. As long as Falcone was alive and asking questions, she would never be truly safe. She was offering to return from the dead, to become the ghost one last time, to prune the final, most dangerous weed from the garden. Marcello stared at the letter, the decision weighing on him like a shroud. To accept her offer was to invite that terrifying, beautiful plague back into his world, but to refuse was to face Falcone's relentless ambition alone. He picked up a pen and wrote a single word on a piece of paper. Yes. The next day, it was delivered back into the city's silent network of whispers, a message bound for a ghost in a foreign land. The final act was about to begin. The kitchen of Riccardo Falcone's estate was a hive of frantic activity. It was the feast of St. Sebastian, and the Don was hosting the most extravagant banquet of the year. Chefs shouted, pots clanged, and the air was rich with the smells of roasting meat and simmering sauces. Amidst the chaos, a new kitchen maid moved with an unnatural calm. She was quiet, efficient, and utterly forgettable. With a simple scarf covering much of her hair and the side of her face, no one paid her any mind. No one recognized the ghost who had returned. Ilara had slipped back into the country as easily as a shadow slips through a keyhole. Her new identity had held perfectly. She secured the position at Falcone's estate with forged references, once again embedding herself in the invisible world of the servant class. This time, her stage was the feast itself. Her poisons were not a single dramatic flourish, but a symphony of death, tailored for each of Falcone's 22 top lieutenants and Falcone himself. For the capo, with a shellfish allergy, a trace of concentrated brine in his soup, enough to trigger fatal anaphylaxis. For the teetotaler, a tasteless alkaloid derived from water hemlock, dripped into his glass of water. For Falcone's notoriously gluttonous brother, a fast-acting paralytic agent baked into the crust of his personal meat pie. Each dose was a work of art, delivered through food, wine, even the steam rising from the platters. As the banquet began, Ilara moved from the kitchen to the dining hall, a server among many. She watched as Falcone and his men feasted, their laughter echoing off the high, frescoed ceilings. They toasted their success, their power, their invincibility. Falcone, at the head of the table, was a modern-day Roman emperor, drunk on his own arrogance. He never noticed the quiet serving girl who refilled his wineglass, her movements precise and her eyes holding the cold, detached gaze of a god passing judgment. It began subtly. A man choked on a piece of bread, his face turning a deep purple. Another slumped forward, a line of foam on his lips. One by one, around the grand table, Falcone's empire died. There was no panic, no screaming, just a series of sudden, quiet endings. Falcone watched, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his mind unable to process the silent, impossible horror unfolding before him. He saw his most feared killers, his most loyal soldiers, extinguished like candles in a breeze. His eyes frantically scanned the room and finally landed on the serving girl with the scarred face. In a flash of sickening recognition, he remembered the auction. He remembered the curse. He opened his mouth to scream, to warn, to call for help, but no sound came out. The poison she had administered to him, a rare toxin from a South American frog, was already crystallizing in his lungs. He could only watch, helpless, as she gave him a final, slight nod before turning and disappearing from the room. That night, the legend of the cursed feast was born. The official story was another gangland mystery, an unsolvable mass poisoning. Ilara, her work finally and truly done, vanished. She took Falcone's Book of Saints from his chapel and mailed it anonymously to a crusading journalist, ensuring that the remnants of his empire would be devoured by the law. Then she faded back into her new life, leaving nothing behind but a ghost story. Years later, in the present day, a team of urban explorers documented their journey through the derelict, decaying Falcone mansion. In a hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the chapel's fireplace, they found a small leather-bound journal. It was filled with notes on chemical compounds and botanical illustrations. It was Ilara's. The final entry, written in a steady, elegant hand, read, "A garden requires pruning. I have tended to the weeds. Now I am free to grow." Her story was over, but her legend leaves behind a haunting final question that echoes through the shadows of history. In the hidden corners of the world, how many other quiet, forgotten people possess the knowledge to rebalance the scales of power, and how many of their stories are buried, just waiting to be unearthed?